Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. We're delighted that we've been able to do this piece of research on behalf of T2A Alliance, and I'll be working through the sort of questions and our results. Feel free to grab me afterwards if you've got any questions or ask any. We were fairly close on the election outcome last year, but we'll have to wait another 5 years, I expect, for the next one. Just to give you a quick overview, I'll tell you a little bit about ComRes, our experience, and the research that we've conducted. And we particularly focused on the issue of maturity in this piece of research, and so looking at both public opinion but also attitude among parliamentarians towards the issue of maturity and how young people in the criminal justice system should be treated. Just before I go into the details of the results, as Rob mentioned, ComRes has been around for 8 years. We focus particularly on policy and communications research, hence the Com and the Res communications research. And we've done a few pieces of research on this topic before. We've actually been able to work with Barrow Cadbury previously a few years ago, and we've done some polling on behalf of the BBC as well as Liberty and other charities about criminal justice and young people within the system. We've done quite a lot of polling as well about violent crime, which has been really interesting. We also have the largest research panel of MPs, so part of this research was a survey of 150 MPs across the House. I'm sure this morning many of the issues have been touched on in terms of what the scene is at the moment, but I just thought before we kick off it's worth just touching on 3 points to consider. First of all, we're in a new political climate. We're in a coalition government. There are fewer safe seats. We've got lots of new ministers. But also within this context is the spending cuts. And as of October last year, really all of our research we find actually is put in the context of spending cuts. And also, as a few of the articles up there sort of demonstrate, there have been concerns about young people in the media and the issues of crime in this country. Even if overall that's declining, it still seems to be quite a popular topic in media coverage. So what did we actually do? We did 2 polls. We did a survey of members of the public representing the whole British population, and we asked them 3 questions. We also asked a couple of questions to MPs, 150 and a representative of the whole House. And as you can see, the research was just conducted last month now. The first question we asked here is we asked members of the public at what age they think people reach maturity in each of these following areas. And as you can see there's a couple of points I just want to draw out now, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. The first thing to note there is that on average, people think that it's about the age of 18 that young people have the ability to understand and to take responsibility for their own actions. The other thing that I think is particularly interesting to draw out, and something that we've been discussing this morning and we'll go into in more depth, is that one there on emotional responsibility and maturity. On average, it's just over 22 years old that people think is the average age that people reach emotional maturity. And I think that's really key to bear in mind in the context of this discussion, as sort of in that age range of sort of 18 to early 20s that we're discussing. So just to give you a little bit more breakdown there. The majority of people think that criminal responsibility should be around 18 years. As we've seen from that table earlier across Europe, at the moment in the UK, criminal responsibility starts at 10 years old. But emotional maturity comes out as a key theme here, and again we see this as something that should be taken into account. It's particularly interesting to notice among the public the difference by age group. So for 18 to 24-year-olds, the average age they thought that people reached emotional maturity is at 20. And among older age groups, that's at about 23. In particular, 26% of 18 to 24-year-olds say that young people are emotionally mature before the age of 18. But that decreases to just 5% of people aged over 65 saying that young people are emotionally mature before 18. The next question we looked at was when a young person who is accused of breaking the law, to what extent each of these factors should be taken into account. As you can see there are results from MPs in green and public in blue. Sorry if you can't quite read all the font there, hopefully you can see it on your presentation. But what we can see here is that the majority of both MPs and members of the public think that each of these factors should be taken into account. Among MPs, age is the top factor there. This is the percentage of people who said to some extent or to a great extent. And among members of the public, it's the emotional and psychological maturity that is the top factor they believe should be taken into account by the courts. I mentioned the political scene earlier, and I thought it'd be quite interesting just to see a quick breakdown here of the MPs by different party groups. It's worth just noting that this sample is representative of the House, which does mean that the sample sizes aren't huge for each of the parties, but you can still see the interesting trends. And I guess in the context of a coalition government, this is really interesting to see the differences there between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative MPs. And consistently in our research, we actually see the Liberal Democrats coming out particularly strong on the importance of taking into account maturity and each of these measures in turn. So thinking about the trends among the public as well, some of these are quite good fun. Women are more likely to agree than men that each of these maturity measures should be taken into account in the criminal justice system. Interestingly, 63% of 18 to 24-year-olds think that age should be taken into account by the courts. That compares to 57% of all people. But among the public, emotional and psychological maturity is again and again seen as the most important factor. And I sort of keep coming back to that, but I think it's actually really useful for us to think about. The final question we asked here is about how young people should be treated in court, whether we should stick with what we currently have, whether they should be treated the same as juveniles, whether they should be approached on a case-by-case basis, or actually as a distinct group. And I think the thing to say here is there's a 50-50 split, both among the public and among members of Parliament. So only half of MPs and half of the public believe that we should stick with what we've got at the moment. And the most popular alternative is to treat young people in the criminal justice system on a case-by-case basis. This clearly fits in with the other questions we've looked at already in terms of taking into account emotional maturity and various other factors as well. Once again, there's an interesting party split. As you can see there, we've got half of Conservative and Labour MPs saying that we should stick with treating young adults as older adults. But the Lib Dems here stand out from the crowd, 52% suggesting that young people should be treated on a case-by-case basis, and indeed 30% suggesting they should be treated as their own separate group. And this really fits into what the Transition to Adulthood Alliance is looking for, really. Actually, there's clear evidence here that there is a sort of demand for rethinking it and actually perhaps approaching a case-by-case basis. Just looking at members of the public particularly, and as has been mentioned earlier, public opinion is key. You know, it does have a role in all of this. But we can see that 1 in 3 members of the public think that 18 to 24-year-olds should be treated on a case-by-case basis, taking into account some of the factors we've already touched on. We also see that actually that figure is particularly high among young people. 13% of 18 to 24-year-olds think that age group should be treated as a separate group. But again, we see the slight difference between men and women. 59% of men think that we should stick with the status quo compared to 47% of women. Now, that's a really quick overview of the results, and I realise that's lots of statistics all at once, so feel free to ask me afterwards. And I think that after lunch, the press release for these results might be available as well. So just some final conclusions as I end. This really just summarises what we've seen so far. There is both an interest among MPs and among members of the public for emotional maturity and responsibilities to be taken into account in the criminal justice system. The majority of people do believe that maturity in all these different areas, particularly emotional maturity and intellectual maturity, but in other factors as well, is reached after 18 years old. But there is a split at the moment in terms of whether we stick with the status quo or actually reform the system. And I think there's an argument here for addressing the approach of treating 18 to 24-year-olds on a case-by-case basis and approaching that further. So if anyone's got any questions, do ask me afterwards. My email address is there as well, if you'd like to drop me a line. Thank you very much.